It started with a whisper, but now the engines are roaring. The Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS, and behind them, the Treasury and Homeland Security, all reportedly aligning toward one single target: the American left. Yes, you heard that right. A multi-agency crackdown is underway, not against foreign spies or extremist groups from abroad, but against domestic nonprofits, advocacy networks, and political donors inside the United States. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. The outlines are already moving, and what happens next could permanently reshape American political life. Here's the kicker. The president is naming names: George Soros, ActBlue, Indivisible, the Open Society Foundations. He's calling them anti-American, violent, dangerous. And now some of the most powerful institutions in the country are being mobilized to take them down. Trump's second term isn't just about governing. It's about payback. And this, right here, may be the most aggressive use of executive power for political retaliation in modern history. Let's rewind. Early September 2025. The country is still reeling from the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, a tragedy that became a rallying cry for Trump's base. Within days, the White House began pushing the narrative that radical left agitators were spreading political violence. 2 weeks later, President Trump signed a presidential memorandum directing federal agencies to detect, prevent, and protect against domestic radical organizations. But the language went further. It ordered the IRS to review philanthropic networks and instructed the DOJ to prioritize cases linked to politically motivated violence. That memo opened the door to something unprecedented: using national security and tax enforcement tools to pursue ideological opponents.
Behind the scenes, former senior advisor Stephen Miller reportedly took the reins, coordinating DOJ prosecutors, IRS investigators, and Treasury analysts to identify targets. Internal discussions began around groups like Open Society Foundations, Indivisible, and ActBlue, accused of promoting unrest or funding anti-government movements. The proposed tactics were severe: revoke tax-exempt status, freeze accounts under federal suspicion, launch civil or criminal investigations, and in some cases, use anti-terror or racketeering statutes to make it stick. Civil rights lawyers called it what it was: a political purge disguised as law enforcement. And yet, inside the administration, it was described as long overdue. The president's allies framed it as justice, cleaning out shadow donors who, they claim, bankroll chaos. But what's taking shape isn't cleanup, it's consolidation, a re-engineering of power that blurs the line between oversight and suppression. By late September, prosecutors at the Justice Department began receiving informal instructions to explore criminal avenues against major liberal organizations. Among them, racketeering, wire fraud, and material support for terrorism laws once meant for mobsters and extremist cells. According to multiple insiders, regional U.S. attorney offices in New York, California, and Michigan were asked to prepare options memos detailing potential legal pathways. It's not a direct order yet, but the signal was clear: find something. At the same time, the White House amplified its message. In speeches and interviews, Trump repeated one phrase: anti-American networks. He accused certain nonprofits of funding domestic subversion, insisting that if they're bankrolling violence, they're going to have problems.
Attorney General Pam Bondi backed the message publicly, saying everything is on the table. That phrase, vague but loaded, echoed across federal offices. Progressive organizations responded with fury. Over 100 nonprofits, including civil rights, humanitarian, and voter advocacy groups, issued a joint statement condemning the administration's tactics. They warned that the campaign threatened the constitutional right to association and expression and could silence dissent nationwide. But inside the movement, fear spread fast. Smaller nonprofits began to back away from political causes. Fundraisers quietly paused campaigns. Legal teams reviewed every statement before publishing. And large philanthropic institutions, even those untouched so far, started holding emergency meetings to discuss operational risk. Law firms that once championed public interest cases were suddenly hesitant to represent politically exposed clients. Some dropped cases. Others quietly scaled back. For the first time in decades, the message was unmistakable. Activism carries risk again. Conservative media, meanwhile, celebrated. They framed it as a long-delayed reckoning, a cleansing of what they called the activist industry. But even some establishment Republicans expressed unease. They know what weaponization looks like, and once you normalize it, you can't control who wields it next. The impact was immediate and visible. Funding froze. The president's public naming of Soros and Open Society foundations with billions in assets sent a chill through America's donor networks. Private philanthropy, which fuels social and legal advocacy, began to stall. Smaller organizations dependent on grants or recurring contributions faced a sudden dilemma: stay vocal and risk being labeled radical, or go silent and survive.
Tax pressure mounted. The IRS, under direct instruction, began auditing select organizations linked to large-scale activism. A single audit doesn't prove guilt, but it drains resources, halts projects, and signals threat. For many nonprofits, just receiving that letter can destroy trust with partners and donors. Legal danger escalated. Reports surfaced that federal prosecutors were exploring RICO statutes, normally used against organized crime, to connect nonprofit funding streams to coordinated civil disorder. If even one case proceeds further, the precedent could be explosive. It would mark the first time the U.S. government has used anti-terror frameworks against domestic political entities, not for violence, but for ideology. Institutional backlash brewed. Civil liberties groups began preparing lawsuits. Universities, law centers, and private firms started drafting amicus briefs to challenge any executive orders or overreaches. Congressional Democrats demanded documentation, oversight hearings, and full transparency on how the crackdown was being coordinated. But the administration appears unmoved. In statements, officials insist it's lawful enforcement against networks that undermine national security. And yet, behind closed doors, even senior staffers admit the goal isn't simply justice, it's deterrence. Make dissent costly. Make opposition fearful. Make every donor think twice. The psychological fallout is enormous. Across the nonprofit world, conversations have shifted from strategy to survival. Keep a low profile. Delay that statement. Hold that campaign until after election season. Fear is now policy, and it's working exactly as intended, because once people start censoring themselves, you don't need to silence them anymore. And that's the quiet genius, or the quiet horror, of what's unfolding. But here's the part nobody's talking about. What happens if this actually goes forward?
What happens when investigations turn into indictments, when tax audits turn into raids, when rhetoric becomes legal precedent? If that happens, if Trump's second term succeeds in fusing political power with prosecutorial authority, America may cross a line it can't walk back from. And that's where the story turns next. So what happens if this actually goes forward? Because let's be honest, this isn't just another political feud. This is the potential re-engineering of American power from within. And what's at stake now isn't policy, it's precedent. If this crackdown holds, it could permanently alter how political opposition functions in America. Think about that. Every administration, left or right, would now have the blueprint. Don't like your critics? Label them extremist networks. Use the IRS, the DOJ, the Treasury. Freeze them, investigate them, starve them out. All while claiming to protect democracy. That's how you normalize political retaliation through bureaucracy. One audit, one subpoena, one quiet investigation at a time. Legal scholars are already comparing this moment to the Nixon years, when the White House kept an enemies list and used the IRS to harass political opponents. But even Nixon never attempted to fuse multiple agencies under one coordinated campaign.
What Trump's team appears to be constructing is something far more sophisticated, an integrated state apparatus for political enforcement. And this time, it's armed with 21st-century tools, financial tracking algorithms, digital surveillance warrants, and expanded definitions of domestic threat. The irony: this strategy isn't emerging from chaos. It's built on law, on process, on paperwork. Each memo, each policy directive is technically legal, on paper. That's what makes it so effective. Because once you blur the line between oversight and opposition control, democracy doesn't collapse overnight. It suffocates quietly, one regulation at a time. And make no mistake, this is bigger than any one president. The next leader, Democrat or Republican, will inherit these powers, and if they decide to use them for their enemies, no one will have the moral ground left to object. Here's why this matters beyond the immediate politics. We are watching a test of how far institutional loyalty can bend before it breaks. Will the DOJ, the FBI, the IRS, agencies that swear independence, enforce directives they privately disagree with, or will they resist, risking their careers to defend constitutional lines? Some insiders claim quiet pushback is already happening. Mid-level attorneys questioning directives, analysts refusing to draft risk profiles for political donors. But if leadership keeps tightening control, that resistance may not survive. Because in this system, silence is safer than dissent. What's unfolding isn't only legal, it's psychological. It's about conditioning, about teaching America that activism has consequences. If you can make citizens believe that political engagement might bring an audit, a subpoena, or an FBI knock at the door, you don't need censorship. You've already achieved compliance. And that's the deeper game: deterrence through fear. It's already working. Nonprofits are delaying campaigns. Journalists are self-censoring. Universities are trimming budgets for controversial programs. A quiet freezing effect is creeping across civil society. Not visible, but powerful. This is how political control evolves in democratic states. Not through coups, through compliance. Not through soldiers, through silence. And yet, there's something else happening too. A backlash is forming. Civil liberties groups are preparing legal challenges that could become historic. Multiple lawsuits are being drafted, some targeting the misuse of IRS authority, others challenging DOJ's application of terrorism statutes. It could reach the Supreme Court, and depending on the rulings, this moment could define the limits of executive power for a generation. Democrats in Congress are already calling for investigations. They want documentation, interagency communication, and testimony from senior officials, including Stephen Miller. But here's the problem. Without subpoena power in certain committees, it's mostly theater. The real checks now lie in the courts and in public awareness. And that's the tightrope America walks tonight. If the public tunes out, this becomes the new normal. If they pay attention, it could still be stopped. Let's zoom out. This isn't just a partisan clash. It's part of a larger global trend, where populist leaders turn state machinery inward, branding domestic critics as enemies of the nation. Hungary did it under Orban. Turkey did it under Erdogan. Each started with foreign-funded NGOs, then expanded to journalists, universities, activists. By the time resistance organized, the legal framework had already changed. Sound familiar? The same narrative now appears in Washington, protecting national security, defending the real America, rooting out radical influence. Different flag, same playbook. The danger isn't just Trump, it's what follows him. Because once citizens get used to the idea that government can punish ideology, the target list will always grow. It might start with the left, but next time, it could be you. So what happens next? There are 3 roads, and none are simple.
Scenario 1. Retrenchment. Legal challenges stall the crackdown. Courts intervene, civil society groups rally, and agencies retreat quietly. In this version, the damage is symbolic, but the message remains: power can be weaponized again. Scenario 2. Escalation. The White House doubles down. DOJ announces official investigations, IRS revokes exemptions, Congress erupts, America descends into a second-term power war, oversight committees versus federal agencies. That path leads to gridlock, mass protests, and an election cycle defined by fear. Scenario 3, normalization, the most dangerous of all. The crackdown becomes background noise. Media moves on, donors adapt, activists quiet down. The government learns it can punish political opposition without backlash and uses that power again, smarter, next time. If that happens, this won't be remembered as a scandal. It'll be remembered as the turning point where democracy accepted control as security. Behind every audit, every investigation, there are real people. Nonprofit employees terrified for their livelihoods, lawyers caught between conscience and career, donors wondering if a single transfer could make them a target. The cruelty isn't always in the law, it's in the ambiguity. No one knows how far this goes or when it stops, and uncertainty, history shows, is one of the most effective tools of control ever invented. That's what's unfolding here. Not open repression, but strategic confusion. No one can say for sure who's next, so everyone steps back. That's how freedom erodes, invisibly, politely, through fear of the unknown.
And if the past is a guide, America's institutions will bend further than anyone expects, until one day they don't snap, they simply stop resisting. That's the real story here. The weaponization of legality itself. A crackdown that doesn't need soldiers, just signatures. And a democracy learning that silence can be enforced without saying a word. So, what do you think this really is? Accountability? Or the birth of a new kind of political control? Because one thing's for certain, this isn't the end. It's the test before the next chapter. Like, share, and stay awake, because this story isn't over. It's just beginning.